G'day guys, welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I hope you're having a great week. I am very excited to bring you today's episode because I have had the amazing chance to interview one of my favourite Australian authors, David Hunt. Now, David Hunt is the author of the books Gert and True Gert. I think I've mentioned these a few times on the podcast here. They're amazing, funny, hilarious, but informative history books about Australia. They're the kinds of history books that are written so well, you guys probably won't be able to put them down. And the audiobooks are even better. Anyway, to give you an idea of David's sense of humour, I'll read his bio from blackinkbooks.com.au. So David Hunt is an unusually tall and handsome man who likes writing his own bios for all the books he has written. David is the author of Gert, The Unauthorised History of Australia, which won the 2014 Indie Award for Non-Fiction and was shortlisted in both the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award and Australian Book Industry Awards. True Gert, the sequel, was published in 2016, as was a book for children, The Nose Pixies. David has a birthmark that looks like Tasmania, only smaller and not as far south. All right, so he's a hilarious guy. I think you're going to love this episode, guys. Strap yourselves in and prepare for a significant dose of humorous Australian history. Let's get into it. All right. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So David is the author of Gert and True Gert, two books that I fell in love with last year. And I hassled him to come on today to sort of talk to us a little bit about his life growing up in Australia, but also about Australian history, how you got into it, and then heroes and villains. Where did you grow up in Australia, David?
Pete, thanks for having me on, mate. I am a Sydney boy, born and bred. So born in the Paddington Women's Hospital, which has now been knocked down for apartments, which is pretty much the story of Sydney over the last 47 years, which is as long as I've been about.
In the last 5 years, shoddy apartments, right?
Pretty shoddy. Yeah, I don't know if it'd be moving into anything that's been built in the last 10 or 12 years or so, no.
Is that situation getting any better, or it's not looking good?
Oh, look! I'm an expert historian. I'm a master of the English language. Sadly, I know bugger all about property development, so probably can't help you on that.
So no tips.
No tips. No tips when it comes to property.
So what was like? What was it like living in Sydney and growing up there? Did you spend all your life there too?
Oh, look, no, I've travelled a bit, and I spent a few months living in the north of England. So, but Sydney's always been my home base, I suppose.
And what was your education like? Did you always think you were going to become a historian, or was that just something that sort of happened to you down the line?
No, that was the product of a midlife crisis when I decided that being a lawyer was getting me down, and I wanted to do something a bit more creative.
I've heard that story a few times, I think.
Yeah. No, I actually got into... I'd always liked history at school, but it was sort of sword and sandals type history. I did ancient history at school, Greeks, Romans, Persians, that sort of thing, and found Australian history to be incredibly dull. And that was partly the way it was taught, I think. And also, I think Australians have a bit of a chip on their shoulder about their own history. And so we've often been a little bit disengaged and disinterested. I really got into Australian history probably about 10 years ago when I was asked to be a writer on a sketch comedy TV project around Australian history with some of the guys from The Chaser. And that never ended up going to air, but the research I did for that led me to believe that Australian history was unique, fascinating, and just had been communicated in a poor way in the school curriculum over time. So I'm a recent Australian history convert.
So what was it? Was there a single moment that you suddenly clicked and went, holy crap, Aussie history is actually really interesting and a story worth telling?
Yeah, look, it was, as I said, it was working on a comedy show. So first of all, we were looking at ways that we could make Australian history stories funny. And then I came across so many funny Australian history stories that were real. I thought, why are we trying to turn this stuff into sketch comedy when the real stuff is so good. And so that was a bit of a brainwave. Whilst we were waiting for the green light to start filming, I wrote an article on the Burke and Wills expedition and submitted it to a magazine. The magazine people passed it on to their sort of related book publishing company, and Gert was commissioned off the back of that piece I did on Burke and Wills. So probably the Burke and Wills sort of story was what got me into writing Australian history in a sort of literary sense.
And so how did you decide to get started for a full book? Was it that they contacted you and were like, you know what, this style that you write in needs to be applied to a broader scale of Australian history?
Yeah, so the magazine passed it on to my co-publisher, Black Ink, who are based down in Melbourne, and they said, would you like to write a book in this style? And I said, sure, yeah, that'll be easy. It was incredibly tricky. But it did give me, I took some time off work, wrote the book, went back to work briefly, and then decided pretty much to toss in the day job and focus on writing and a little bit of performance type stuff, yeah.
And what was the process like when they said to you, you know, we want you to do this, but obviously, what was it, the first 100 years of Australian history in the first book there? What was the process like of deciding how you were going to flesh that out and which bits to put in, which bits to leave out, how detailed to get?
Well, my original pitch was for to have a book that went all the way up to Federation, and I think I handed... My book was about a year overdue, and I'd sort of got up to 1824, the naming of Australia, and I said to the publisher, look, you know, I've got sort of, you know, 80,000 odd words now. Why don't we leave it at this, and I'll do a volume 2? And they sort of said, oh, yep, sure. And so it never had the scope that was originally pitched. But that's because when I pitched, after being told go and write a book, you know, I prepared a pitch document, and I had no real idea at the time, and it wasn't until I really got into the research that it became clear to me that I'd be taking longer to tell the story of Australian history.
And how is that done? How do you research it properly, right? Like, I take it you don't just get on Wikipedia and just summarise a few articles.
Why not? That's what all the young folks today. No, I spent a lot of time at the Mitchell Library. There are lots of historical documents, journals, letters and the like available online through a number of resources. Trove is a great one. Various libraries like the New South Wales State Library have got quite large history collections online. Project Gutenberg is another one which had, you know, journals of people like William Dampier and Joseph Banks. So, yeah, look, I basically locked myself away for over a year and read originals, the primary documents, and lots of secondary material as well.
And so what was the David like going into that and the David like after that in terms of his understanding and appreciation of Australian history? Because I know for most people today, especially my age, it's kind of like, I would say the average person probably has a basic idea of what happened, but either doesn't want to talk about it or doesn't really know very much to really have an opinion on it. What was it like for you?
Well, look, I went in knowing a bit, having always had sort of a passing interest and done some work on the TV project. But certainly, look, I came out of it. I went in thinking that I was a humorous writer writing about history, and I came out of it saying, really, in going forward, I'm going to be a historian who writes comically. So the second book, True Gert, is a bit more historically packed and denser and darker than the first one, and that probably reflects that I took the history side of things a lot more seriously than when I started on Gert.
And so were there things that you came across that sort of were the complete opposite of what you were thinking, or shocks and surprises that you weren't taught in school?
Oh, well, most of it isn't taught in school. I mean, the suggestion that Bass and Flinders, the great exploring double act, Flinders is the most, one of the most important characters in Australian history. He was the first person to circumnavigate the continent. He actually proposed the name Australia. He discovered Bass Strait and proved that Tasmania was an island, for which we're all grateful to this day. And there are more statues of him in Australia than any other man, more things named after him. He's an incredibly
There's a book about his cat.
Book about his cat, Trim. There are more statues of Trim the cat than of any other cat in Australia as well. So they were a very important man and cat double act. But there's this love letter that he writes to George Bass in 1800 that's really quite racy. And the fact that Bass and Flinders were more than just sailing buddies is something that certainly isn't regularly taught in our schools. That was a story that surprised me. But I changed my views on lots of things. I mean, I have a much more nuanced view of Ned Kelly than after researching him than before I researched him. I think he was he's essentially a poor horse thieving, cock killing terrorist with a penchant for cast iron fetish wear, but he also has incredible charisma and depth and a degree of political vision. So it was quite a complex character, which I hadn't appreciated before I really got stuck into him. I think what I came to appreciate is that when Australian history has traditionally been taught, lots of our great historical figures are reduced to archetypes. They're sort of one-dimensional. And what I realised was that a lot of these great characters are more like characters in Game of Thrones. There's a bit of bad stuff, there's a bit of good stuff, and that people are complex. And that's what I try and get across in some of my writing, that, Lachlan Macquarie wasn't just the guy who built things and named everything Macquarie. He was also, an alcoholic, a bit of a pants man, had a history of fraud. Those things made him a more colourful character, and those things about his background are often overlooked in some of our mainstream histories.
It's really difficult too, I found, because it depends on who you read. Like, I read the Explorers by Tim Flannery recently, and then Dark Emu as well. And it seems like both of those, well, although Tim Flannery kind of just dives in a little bit into Mitchell and Major Mitchell and what he was like, it seems like he paints him in a much nicer light than he was painted in Dark Emu, where it was his racist side was played up a lot more.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know what to believe, right? When you just read.
Well, both are probably true, and we would. Mitchell was reasonably enlightened. He was the guy who actually says we need to be using Aboriginal place names.
Yep.
As when he was Surveyor General. So lost explorers could ask the locals for directions. But he had a greater appreciation of Aboriginal culture than most. And yes, in Bruce Pascoe's book Dark Emu, he looks at Mitchell's journals and diaries pretty closely, and there are bloody conflicts with Aboriginal people on the banks of rivers, and was
that Hume that was on the Murray River? I've forgotten the name of him, the guy that was going down there and suddenly comes around a corner and there's 500 Aboriginals ready to kill him on a boat.
Mitchell certainly had that experience when he was out sort of pottering around the sort of Lachlan and Macquarie rivers. So that was not an uncommon for explorers to have conflict with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I mean, Edmund Kennedy was and nearly most of his party were bumped off.
Yep.
Ludwig Lockhart, went missing, presumed killed by Aboriginal people. Understandably so. I mean, there was the Aboriginal people who would have been meeting these explorers would have, if not had first-hand experience of Europeans moving them off their land, would certainly have heard about it and certainly would have formed a strongly negative impression of any passing stray Europeans.
What was that like? The first fleet gets here because Cook really didn't have that much to do with the local Indigenous people, right? He kind of bumped into them in the north, and that was about it.
He bumped into them his first encounter was with the Gwavil at Botany Bay, or Stingray Harbour, as he called it at the time, in Sydney. And when the two Gwaggle warriors sort of threw spears and rocks at the approaching longboat, he ordered them to be fired on. And so that was the first contact that Cook had. Also, again, up at the Endeavour River near Cooktown, as it is now in Queensland. Again, there was conflict with local Aboriginal people, but also an attempt at reconciliation. Reconciliation rocks up there when Cook came to appreciate that he was causing some problems.
So did they have a good understanding at the time of what was sort of to come? Do you think, in terms of if I claim this land for the kingdom, we're going to come and shift, these people are gone. I'll give you guys 10 years and it's over.
No, not at the time of Cook. I mean, Cook actually didn't bother claiming the east coast of Australia until he got up into the Torres Strait on what we now know as Possession Island, where he took possession of effectively the eastern half of Australia. And explorers had a habit of sort of claiming any bit of old land that they came across. Cook at the time wasn't that impressed with the land. Neither was Banks. There was no real Joseph Banks, his botanist sidekick. There was no plan to colonise at the time. That really happens in the 1880s when America is no longer accepting Britain's convicts after the American War of Independence, and Britain is desperately casting around for somewhere unpleasant and distant and surrounding water to send them to. So
joke's on them now.
The joke's on them now. Well, after watching The Ashes the other night, the joke may be back on us.
True.
So no, that was not really a factor in Cook's mind at the time.
So what was the because I guess I recently read Australian Aboriginals, I think by Broome as well, Richard Broome. Yeah, and it was eye-opening, just the complexity of the relationships, and that there were sort of they weren't just a very tumultuous set of relationships. It was always war, always fighting. It wasn't that kind of situation, right? It was definitely not black or white. No. Well, I mean, look, there was certainly war and there was fighting, but some of the stuff that Broome writes about the relationships up in northern Australia on cattle stations and the like, where the Aboriginal people, many of them stayed on their own land, were incorporated into the local economy, and took pleasure and pride in work on cattle stations in the north. Of course, they weren't paid properly for the work that they did, and not everything was hunky-dory. But it's wrong to suggest that Australian, European and Aboriginal relationships were all about conflict and dispossession. There was often accommodation, there was often attempts at cross-cultural understanding, and there were good and bad people on both sides, I think it'd be fair to say. So what aspects of Australian history, when you were writing these books, did you find that you think get whitewashed or ignored or not, not even told enough? Are there certain stories that just got forgotten that are better than the ones we do know? Well, certainly
look, Aboriginal history had been not only neglected but whitewashed out of the way that history was taught until really, I think, after the bicentenary in 1988. Certainly when I went through school in the 70s and 80s, there was no real acknowledgement of Aboriginal people at all, other than a sort of passive people who got rolled over when the continent was settled by Britain.
Why do you think that was?
Oh, well, I think part of the great during the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a vast sort of nationalist approach to Australian history where we venerated the sort of outback men who expanded the frontier, and they were the heroes. You know, your boundary riders, your drovers, your shearers, your horsemen, your explorers.
Many of whom were Aboriginal.
Many of whom were Aboriginal, and the idea that these people who conferred vast riches upon the Australian people and opened up the continent for wheat and beef and gold and all of those things that made Australia at the turn of the 20th century the richest country in the world on a per capita basis. The idea that these frontiersmen had considerable blood on their hands was not a popular one, and so many of the stories were buried. Many of them weren't told in the first place because certainly with the native police in Queensland, where some of the worst frontier violence occurred, there was a deliberate policy of silence and of not keeping records, and those few records that were kept mysteriously disappeared.
Do you want to explain too what the native police were?
Yeah, the native police were actually groups of Aboriginal frontiersmen who were shipped up from the south, with each group of policemen led by a white officer, and their job was effectively to, in inverted commas, disperse Aboriginal people from areas that were being settled, and that dispersal often involved basically shooting up the locals. And so we have this notion of Aboriginal people today as being sort of one common group of people. Of course, that's not the case. You've got a couple of hundred different languages, you've got hundreds of tribes, and so the Aboriginal people from down in southern New South Wales and northern Victoria had no real feelings of kinship for the people they were displacing. And so you've probably got over 30,000 Aboriginal people killed in the Queensland Northern Territory frontiers, often at the hands of Aboriginal dispersal squads run, controlled, directed by white officers.
Because that sounds like, when I was reading that in Aboriginal Australians, that seemed like a massive uncomfortable truth that doesn't seem to be spoken about. Obviously at the hands of us as well, but it's weird, and I kind of get annoyed when people say, oh, well, like, because I'm teaching English, people are quite often like, talk about the Aboriginal accent. And it's like, but that's like saying the European accent, right, in English. It's kind of like there are so many different groups and they weren't necessarily on good terms with one another.
So, no, not at all.
Was it like that throughout the continent when we got here too, that there was a lot of conflict and that was used to kind of help sow a bit of chaos?
Before we arrived, the conflict was very local. You had Aboriginal groups who would have a set pattern of migration where they would take in different resources at different times of the year. They were mostly, a highly nomadic people. And so you would have clashes between different groups of Aboriginal people over resources, over women, over various other things. But it was local, and there were ways of resolving those disputes, which allowed everybody to get on to the extent that they weren't wiping each other out. It wasn't until Europeans started, and these were, back in those days, the Aboriginal people who you were fighting, if you're an Aboriginal person, were people who you had to live with, on a long-term basis. Their groups would still be in your area going forwards. What happened when Europeans arrived is they moved Aboriginal people out of their tribal areas to quite distant areas.
And this was sort of done, what is both directly and indirectly, right? Like they kind of did force them off the land and they settle there, but then also with their cattle and sheep that they just kind of let go into the wild, that just decimated a lot of the resources that the indigenous tribes were using, and so they had to move.
Yeah. Well, so you have Aboriginal people being moved on because the waterways that they relied on were where sheep station and cattle station owners wanted to put their flocks and herds. So you've got people being moved on basically because their water resources are being taken. But they were actively picked up by and used as trackers. So some of the early Tasmanian Aboriginal conflict was between trackers who'd been moved down from New South Wales into Tasmania to track Aboriginal people in Tasmania. But certainly Europeans gave some Aboriginal people guns, horses, moved them on to people who they had no previous contact with, didn't have to maintain amicable relationships with. That's... You'd have to say there was always conflict between some Aboriginal groups, but throwing Europeans into the mix, that spiralled out of control.
So did it change your view of, I guess, compassion or towards certain groups or certain historical figures too when you learnt more about them? Because I was reading a bit about convicts, and at first I think, these are like white slaves that have come over from England. And then you do sort of read about some of the stuff that they got up to and how they treated the locals, and you're like, actually, they're kind of pieces of shit sometimes. So they're not necessarily these, victims that are innocently over here.
Well, look, a lot of the conflict in the early days with Aboriginal people was at the hands of convict shepherds, convict stockmen, convict woodcutters who were out and about in Aboriginal territory with limited supervision.
And was it also that they'd been given this place, this is where you live, this is where you have to survive, and if you don't sort your, defend yourself with your life, you're probably going to die?
Yeah, look, certainly there was a great fear of Aboriginal people, particularly Pemulwuy in the early days of the colony in New South Wales. Europeans, including officers, believed that he was essentially magic and was immune to bullets and firearms. I mean, he regarded as a supernatural force of nature, and the way that he attacked homesteads and farms, led a fairly effective guerrilla insurgency in what is now the middle of Western Sydney. But no, look, the convicts, are often portrayed as, in chains and wearing little black arrows on white. So they weren't like that at all for the most part. They had pretty much free rein. They weren't put in prisons. Many of them had far more opportunities as convicts in New South Wales and later other states than they ever would if they'd stayed back home in Britain.
Yep.
So some of Australia's most successful early entrepreneurs were themselves convicts made good, who here, where there was less class pressure keeping them down, where, you got by on the strength of your own talents, really made a go of it over here, whilst back in Britain they would never have had the opportunity to break into business in the way they did. So...
were most of them too hard criminals? Because we get that story of a lot of the time they stole a loaf of bread. Is that representative of the majority of them or just a minority?
No, well, I think on the first fleet of 740-odd 49 convicts, I think 28 had committed handkerchief theft. Another 78 had stolen goods, including handkerchiefs, and another 225 had stolen other cloth goods or handkerchief precursors. So we're talking about largely petty thieves, whether that be food, whether that be cloth, which at the time before mass production of cloth was very valuable. Quite a few stealing lead from church roofs, and some who'd engaged in various forms of assault and robbery. But on the whole, the people who, I think Elizabeth Beckett was in her 70s and had stolen a bit of cheese. So Bedford, I think. These aren't master criminals. These are the British law in many ways punished crimes against property far more severely than crimes against people.
Yep.
And a lot of the people who came out here for 7 years, 14 years life had been convicted of, effectively shoplifting type offences. They were domestic servants who'd, stolen the silver spoons from their masters.
Is that also because the British knew that maybe we shouldn't be sending, our worst criminals there? We should send the ones that are likely to make a go of it and probably not do too bad.
Well, Britain didn't have at the time, didn't really have prisons to punish people at the time. So the worst punishment, short of death, was transportation.
Yeah.
And they're over in the 1780s when New South Wales was settled. There were over 200 crimes for which to be hanged, including interfering with a fish pond, stealing a rabbit from its warren.
Is that like skipping a rock over a fish pond? What is interfering with a fish pond include?
I think it was sort of an agricultural type crime.
Yep.
Attacking somebody's salmon stock. And being in the company of gypsies for 1 month was a capital offence. 3 weeks, fine. 1 month, you are having problems.
Yeah.
So no, these, but often the death sentence was commuted, and transportation was preferred. People were still hanged. If people who stole, goods valued at more than 10 shillings were more likely to be hanged. But lots of people who committed hangable offences were sent here. But given you could be hanged for just about anything, that's probably not that surprising.
And so, what would have life been like for them on the ships, and then once they got to Australia too? Do we get much of that right when we hear about it or read about it in just common books? Or
the first fleet was an incredibly humane, government-run, government-controlled mixture of private and naval ships. But it only had a 2% mortality rate, which was much better than the mortality rate on previous convict ships that had shipped Britain's convicts to America.
And was that mainly related to disease?
That was related to Governor Phillip being humane and decreeing that convicts would have the same rations as the soldiers and himself, and making sure that they had sufficient clothing. He refused to leave port in Britain until basically the convicts were well supplied and provisioned, and proved himself to be a compassionate and able administrator. The second fleet that came out sort of 3 or so years later had an over 30% mortality rate on some ships because it was the government had outsourced responsibility to private enterprise, and they paid people for how many convicts were loaded in Britain and not for how many were unloaded in New South Wales. And a dead convict was meant that the profit margins of the slavers who were shipping them out were greater. And so they were underfed, neglected, had their goods stolen, had food stolen from them, which the ship captains then, sold to people when they arrived in Sydney. So we got the Brits got the first bit of convict transportation right, and the second bit terribly wrong. And then after that, after the second fleet, everybody was sort of so shocked that there were improvements, but it was still a pretty big deal being shipped over here, and a leaky ship in close quarters with people who collected an impressive assortment of unpleasant diseases and
smallpox
disorders. Smallpox, typhus, cholera, influenza. It was always fraught travelling that sort of distance at sea.
So what's it like today? The average Brit would probably cut off their right leg to get a chance to live in Australia. How long was it throughout history that it took for that news to kind of get back home and be like, oh crap, actually?
Not very long at all. Not very long at all. Indeed, in sort of 1819, I think Sidney Smythe, who was a clergyman in England and one of the great satirists and writers of the early 19th century, commented that there were effectively, he believed, and the authorities believed, that people were committing petty crimes in the hope of being shipped out.
Really?
As a convict. Yeah.
But getting hanged instead.
And the government basically sent out a guy, Commissioner Big, to investigate how convicts were being treated in the colony, in the colony, amongst other things. He produces a report that says we have to treat these people a lot worse to sort of kill off the incentive for people to commit crimes in the hope of free passage out to the colonies. Because convicts by that stage, by the early 19th century, were getting a much better diet than middle-class people back in Britain.
And they were having the opportunities, right, to get land, to start businesses, to.
Yeah, after they'd served their time, they were commonly until 1830, when sort of land grants were abolished. They'd commonly get granted land by the governor to farm. Some of them, set up profitable trading businesses. It was from probably the end of the sort of Napoleonic Wars, sort of 1815 or so, coming to Australia began to look pretty attractive for lots of poor people back in Britain and Ireland.
And what did you learn much whilst you were writing these books about the history of Australian English and how that kind of developed from these first colonies?
I certainly. One of the things I'm interested in is the origin of Australian phrases, and there are several of those in the books, and indeed in the book that I'm writing at the moment, Girt Nation, which is volume 3 of the Girt.
Well, that's it. Get your hands on them, guys. Get your hands on them. They're a good read.
Yeah. I probably do a lot more. I'll be doing a lot more of that. There's an excellent book by Kel Richards called The Story of Australian English.
I just finished reading that. It's brilliant.
And so, and of course, there's the Macquarie Dictionary's got a lot of Australian words and phrases. There's a project based out of ANU which has collected Australian words that have developed in Australia that we would now regard as particularly Australian.
Is that the Australian National Dictionary or something it's called?
Yeah. So I'm fascinated by the way that language evolves, and it's really interesting to think that the Australian accent was probably in place by about 1830. It takes about 50 years when you get people from all sorts of different regions, put them together for those accents to flatten out to form something new.
And the crazy thing about that, right, would be that would be in the grandchildren, whilst their parents and their grandparents were still alive. So you would have had this strata of all kinds of different accents, but it's finally kind of getting stable at the bottom level, right?
Yeah, that's right. And certainly Australian English, the flash language, which was the thieves' cant commonly spoken by thieves actually really got a foothold in Australia, which is unsurprising given its convict number of thieves who were sent out.
Yeah.
So all sorts of words that we have in Australia today came from flash language, thieves language back in Britain. So things like swag, words like bash, loot, all of these sorts of things. There's probably 30 or 40 different words in Australia that are commonly used today that trace their origins back to the sort of British thieves underground for words that they would often use amongst themselves that didn't have a lot of currency in Britain more broadly, but really took off.
It's really funny how, like, I've got a history in genetics and biology, and it's really funny how much it's kind of like words are like genes, where if you have a bottleneck in a population and they have a certain trait that is unique to the broader species or something, that suddenly goes off and like crazy if that population gets isolated. And it seems to have been the same thing with Australian English, where once we were isolated, all these other words kind of came to fixation in general parlance, and that wasn't back home in Britain.
No, and indeed, people were looking for new words for things, and if we were more likely to pick up bits of obscure British dialect here in Australia than those words were to actually take off in Britain.
Because there were so few people, right?
There were so few people. So if you've got one guy from some, strange small village in Warwickshire where they call use a certain word for something, which isn't in common usage in Britain, but they come out and they apply that word down here, and other people say, oh, that's a useful word, we'll pick that up.
Just 20 people have to be convinced to use it, and you've nailed it.
And that's exactly right. So we've got a lot of dialect words. I mean, larrikin, the word, which is now regarded as a great Australian word, when it was originally meant a troublesome and often violent youth rather than a knockabout, likeable bloke as it is today.
Yep.
But that's probably a bit of Northern English dialect for larking about, or to larrick, as I think up in Warwickshire or somewhere like that. But that was not a common word in England, and here it morphed into something else. But we also picked up words from other places. The word bloke, which is something that we see as quintessentially Australian, is probably actually a gypsy word, a Romany word deriving from a gypsy word for friend, loke, without the B. We've got
Sheila or something is from Irish, right, or from Gaelic? Yeah, for a name or a woman. Yeah.
Yeah. So Irish men from the 1820s on in Australia were commonly called Paddy.
Yep.
And Irish women were commonly called Sheila, as to refer to an Irish woman. And that term Sheila then became to be applied more broadly to women, in a broader sense. So the origin of Sheila changed from being confined to Irish women to going more broadly. Similarly, Matilda, in Waltzing Matilda was people would commonly refer to, or Germans would, a term for a German girlfriend or woman was their Matilda.
Was he also in that? Was he referring to his swag and like carrying it along the road when he was saying waltzing his Matilda?
Yep. So waltz, as you know, is a German dance, and Matilda was a German girlfriend. And we had huge German populations in South Australia, which was Queensland, where the first free settlers were.
Got some history there in my blood.
Yeah. So we've got all of this German heritage, and to waltz came in terms of an itinerant worker, was to sort of dance from place to place.
Yep. And
the Matilda was their swag.
Yep.
Instead of going to bed with your German girlfriend, you'd go to bed with your blanket. And And so waltzing Matilda was to sort of, carry a swag around the country looking for work, but it has those sorts of Germanic origins.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I absolutely loved that book, The Story of Australian English, because it showed just those multiple different waves of kind of effect on the Australian language, right? Like the goldfields, and then the First and Second World Wars, and
well, there are terms today that are used around the world that come from so nugget.
Yeah,
nugget of gold appears to be an Australian word. It appears to, and that probably comes from a nug, a lump of clay or something, which again is an obscure Northern English dialect term.
Yep.
And of course now all around the world people refer to gold nuggets, but that is probably an Australian gold rush term, as is fossicking. To fossick, that's again, right. An obscure British dialect word. And a fossicker in whichever obscure region of Britain it came from was a nuisance, a pest.
Yeah.
And so somebody who was sort of scrabbling around in the dirt, often on your patch of dirt, trying to look for your gold, you regarded as a pest, and the term for a sort of, a small-time gold digger became to be a fossicker. So, yeah, it's interesting the way that words get picked up and then their meaning changes over time.
Well, I said to my wife the other day, who's from Brazil, I said to her, just have a fossick in the backyard, you'll find it somewhere. And she was just like, what the hell are you talking about? What does that mean? I'm like, look for it in the backyard.
And I don't think fossick has taken off beyond Australia and New Zealand, but some of our words have, and it's not just the words, but the way that we speak the language. So, for example, it's in parts of Australia, people, instead of saying, you, and referring to a group of people plural, will say yous.
Yep.
The yous guys.
Yep.
And that probably came from a small group of Irish people who had that back in Ireland. And you see patches of that sort of speech pattern in Ireland and patches of it in America as well. But that probably has an Irish origin, and the way that we shorten our words, by putting an O or an A or on the end. So, I'm Davo, an avocado is an avo, an afternoon's an arvo.
Do you think a big part of that was the fact that we were trying to differentiate ourselves, and that's a sort of underpinned, aside from the fact that we were a sort of melting pot of different dialects and accents, were we also trying to push ourselves away and be unique in developing Australian English in our culture?
Well, there's a theory that until probably the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, there was a pretty common Australian accent all across Australia. Unlike Britain and America, where you have populations that have been living together in the same area for, generations that develop their own accents, here you're bringing people in from all sorts of different parts of the world, and so you're developing something that flattens out those differences. And so Australians have got a very flat accent. And as they moved out of Sydney, they took that accent with them. And you get, minor differences perhaps with an Adelaide accent and a Sydney accent, but it's all pretty much the same.
Yeah.
What you did get, though, was differences in the way that accent was expressed. And that's probably a rebellion against the British elocution movement, where in the 1870s, 1880s, people wanted to speak proper English, which was a Southern English.
So the upper class wanted people to speak proper English.
And so the upper class put on this plummy voice, attempt sort of, in some ways, copy almost a Southern English accent, and a group of people at the other end of the class spectrum said, we're not having that, and deliberately broadened their accent. Mm-hmm. And they're also the sort of group who started contracting words. Rather than speaking the full word, they'd go for the abbreviation. So possibly part of that contraction of speech accompanies the rebellion against the sort of plummy elocution style English that came in towards the back end of the 19th century.
Far out. Well, I could probably keep you here all day, but final sort of question, how would you describe how Australians view their history versus, say, someone from Britain where they have a much longer history? Is there a significant difference in how we look at ourselves as Australians and Brits would look at themselves as Brits?
Very much so. And I think, I say in various talks and things that I've done that Australians traditionally believed that they didn't have a proper history, that their history was short, and they believed, because this is what they were taught at school for generations, that to have a proper history, you had to have, great battles, castles,
classical music, art,
all of that. That's what history was, and it was a very European view of history, and so we had a real chip on our shoulder about our own history. We also wanted to ignore parts of our own history, both the frontier violence and the mistreatment of Aboriginal people, which, was probably a bit embarrassing, but also, the convict stain was something that people would do anything to hide, having a convict in your family tree. So people were ignoring their own personal family histories and wanting to sort of gloss over this era of convictism, and because it was embarrassing to be descended from a bunch of crooks. I mean,
quickly there, why did that suddenly flip? Because my dad was telling me that in his generation, when he was growing up, everyone was like, hush, hush, you've got convicts in your blood, hush, hush. But nowadays it's almost like, yeah, we've got convict blood, yeah. What was the watershed moment?
It's really the 1980s where you start to get that change coming through. And the bicentenary actually had a big impact on it, the idea of all these ships coming in, and people thought, hello, this is actually sort of something to be interested in and a little bit proud about. Government, family historians had a lot to do with it. The government started opening up records that had been sealed to family historians in the 1970s. People were actually able to research their convict past in a much easier way than they had in the past. And so I think there was more interest in families looking at their own family histories that made having a convict a little bit more responsible. And Australians are probably, keener genealogists than just about anyone else.
My family's nuts for it at the moment. They're going crazy with putting it together. But it's always funny. What blows my mind is always if you were to find out your grandfather murdered someone, you'd freak, and you'd keep it hush-hush. But you find out that one of your ancestors a few steps back in the family tree did, and you're like, wow, he killed someone. How cool is that?
Well, I've got some very, very dodgy ancestors. I've got lots of the stealing silver spoon types.
Yeah.
Dating as far back as the Second Fleet, but I've got one very, very dodgy character who came out from Scotland, changed his name, assumed the name of this woman's husband who he was travelling out with. This woman pretended he was a husband. He wasn't. He'd eloped with her. He comes to Australia and commits a string of unpleasant sex offences against young women, leaves his wife. His second wife is murdered on the Victorian goldfields in a bar. He was a suspect.
Yep.
Not a nice bloke. Changed his name again. Difficult to trace the family tree. People who keep on changing their names and recreating themselves. But now, his daughter, who was my mother's grandmother, my mother remembers her grandmother. Mm-hmm. She changed her name to avoid having the same name as members of this family, where she was ashamed of her past. Nowadays, I look back on that story and think, unpleasant guy, but what an interesting story. But I think when you were closer to it, people were far more ashamed.
So do you think one of the differences, too, between, say, Britain and Australia, even with immigration, is that we're even the people from the First Fleet that got here have a shorter history, just like immigrants who arrived after the Second World War or even today, and so we're sort of a bit more accepting on that side than somewhere like Britain, where they can trace their history back thousands of years?
Well, Australians still saw themselves as British, effectively. Australians remained British citizens until 1948. Australian citizenship was a concept until 1948. South Australia still flew the Union Jack flag until 1956, I think. So people who were living in Australia who regarded themselves as Australians also regarded themselves as British and saw themselves as part of that long British history and saw the history that they had out here as somehow debased or dirty or not as interesting.
Yeah.
And, you know, you'll still meet the occasional elderly person today who, when they are going on a holiday to Britain, talks about going home. There are still some Australians who call Britain home, which, you know, I think that's almost disappeared today. But that's a fairly recent thing to have gone.
Far out. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on this episode. It's been a long one. Shortly, what should people expect if they get when they get their hands on these books, Gert and True Gert? What should they expect once they start opening these pages?
Although they should expect to learn about the beauty and the terror that is Australian history, but they should also expect to have a bit of a laugh. I mean, what I try to do is communicate Australian history in an entertaining way, because I was so used to being not entertained by Australian history at school. So it's looking at providing real historical information in a way that is broadly accessible. That's my aim, and my aim is to keep on doing that so I don't have to go back to work as a lawyer.
I think you succeeded. I'm looking forward to the third one, and I think if you're going to get the audiobooks too, because I think you reading them and with the notations in there with the bah and the whoosh sounds separating it was beautiful.
Yeah. I try and work out how to do humorous footnotes in an audiobook. Yes. So I have audio cues for my footnotes, and I think something like 220 different character voices, although all of my Scotsmen...
Did you practice those beforehand, or did you just wing it?
For the first book, I winged it, and then a lot of that... I had the first book was pulled together very quickly, and I had a Greek sound engineer whose English actually wasn't that good, and they just wanted stuff in the can. I did this terrible Chinese accent. And I said, "Oh, mate, look, I think that probably sounded really, really racist. Can I do that again?" And he said, "No, mate, all good. Yeah, keep going." And so, and there's my very racist Greek accent. No, I took the time for the second book to pre-record character voices and on my phone. So just before I do them in the studio, I'd play them and get them right in my head. But yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. Not being a voice actor, trying to do that many character voices.
Oh, I think you nailed it. Anyway, David Hunt, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, mate.
Cheers, Pete. Thanks, mate.
All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope you got a lot out of it. David is clearly a wealth of knowledge, a fountain of Australian historical knowledge. It was a pleasure having him on the podcast, and I thoroughly recommend that you guys grab his book, Gert, and his book, True Gert, and rumour has it there's a third one on the way in the next few years as well. So you'll find these at any good bookstores near you. Anyway, that's all for today, guys. I appreciate you joining me, and I'll see you next time. Peace.